Ah, Smart Water, now in a sleek can.
This feels cool, literally.
Perfect for social gatherings and on the go.
Should I start wearing turtlenecks?
One sip at a time, friend. Smart Water cans, for those with a taste for taste. Get yours today.
This episode is brought to you by Temptations Cat Treats. Your cat will come running for the perfectly irresistible Temptations Creamy Puree and Temptations Lickable Spoon Cat Treats. The best time to feed lickable cat treats to your cat is anytime. Feed by hand for a playful moment, in a bowl for a creamy treat, or as a topper to make mealtime fun. Visit TemptationsTreats.com to learn more.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. My guest today is Lura Forcum. Professor Forcum has a PhD in consumer psychology, but she moved from academia to politics and is now the president of the Independence Center, which represents people who are fed up with partisan politics and feel politically homeless. Lura Forcum, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So I wanted to touch on something very different before we sort of got into the meat of things, because I'm pretty sure you're the first marketing professor I've talked to on the podcast in a lot of years. And it seems to me that your background, your training, you probably bring certain things to your analysis and understanding of politics that folks with more traditional backgrounds, like political science, law, economics, that sort of thing, wouldn't. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on how you see, what your training does that maybe brings a unique or somewhat different perspective to all of these issues we're going to be talking about.
Absolutely. So there are kind of two things that I see my training contributing. One of the things is, there's actually a few different flavors of marketing PhDs. One of them is like highly mathematical. One of them is very cognitively focused on how the brain works in making judgments and decisions. And my background is in social psychology, or that's the theoretical underpinning for my type of marketing PhD. And so I describe that as my expertise is how people work, especially how they work in groups and how we understand each other, how we share ideas, how we get persuaded or don't. A lot of different aspects of human perception and interaction that are really important for political science and politics and civic life. And I don't hear them discussed a whole lot, which is kind of interesting. I think it's really important to understand, for example, how in-groups and out-groups behave with one another if we're trying to understand polarization. And so I think that's something that social psychology contributes and that marketing can contribute that's really valuable. And another aspect is, and this is something I have only learned as I've been involved in trying to share the Independence Center's ideas more broadly, but it's really striking how different consumer marketing approaches are from how political marketing is carried out. And, one of the things that I've observed in just the limited amount of time that I've been doing this is that political marketing seems to kind of assume that voters are going to come to the two parties and that the parties don't need to offer something that actually appeals to a wide group of voters. And that's really different from how firms carry out marketing, right? Because if you assume that consumers will just figure out that you have a great product and come to you, then you're going to go out of business. Marketing is really the function of marketing is to help companies understand what consumers need. And I don't see really a capability within political and partisan politics that's trying to understand voters and deliver things that they want.
And I want to talk about the independent in Independence Center. So obviously you're focusing on independence, and there are a couple ways to look at this. For instance, if you just take a look at the percentage of Americans who say, well, I'm an independent, well, that's been going up for a long time. Gallup has it at something around 43%, which is way more than around the 28% for Democrats and Republicans. But as a political scientist, I look at that and I say, well, wait a second. My people have looked at this for a long time. And they say, well, actually, these people aren't real independents. They might say they are, but if you look at their voting record, you ask a follow-up question or two, most of them are what I'd call sort of closet Democrats or Republicans. We call them leaners, right? And so when we look at true independents, we're talking about maybe 12% or so, the electorate, give or take. And so I was curious what you make of this pretty large discrepancy between how people self-identify and how they actually vote, how they actually act.
So that's a really interesting point. It's true that people are calling themselves independents. And I think this actually brings together a few different things that are really important in terms of how the Independent Center looks at its work. So the first thing is that we define being an independent as not just voting for a third party, but also swing voting and split ticket voting. And we see quite a bit of that behavior recently. So really what we're saying is independents are just nonpartisans. And that's really important for accountability of elected officials, right? Because if you're a partisan, then you really prefer your side to be in power over the other side so strongly that you're not going to change your vote based on, for most people, they're not going to change their vote based on the candidate that's being offered or policies that are being enacted or failed to be enacted, right? So it just really limits accountability. And the people that we're trying to speak to and identify are people who say, no, I'm not here. I am not a partisan at heart. I expect government to work. I expect you guys to, stop with the winner takes all mentality and actually govern in a bipartisan fashion. And I think that is tremendously valuable to the political process. And, the parties really don't want that kind of accountability and competition. And the other thing that I think I would say, kind of bringing in the social psychology lens here, is that people love to tell you about their identity. They love to think about identities, and they like to share them because it helps you feel like you belong, and it helps you feel like other people know you if they know your identity. So I think when we're talking about the difference between true independents and people who are just leaners, I think they're telling you something really important if they say, I'm independent. Because if they really felt like they were Democrats or Republicans, or even lean that way, they would want to share that. That's part of being known and understood. But they are deeply dissatisfied with both options. And so I think that's really important information that they're telling the parties, and the parties are sort of cutting off channels to listen to this feedback and respond to it.
And so you've hit on this a little bit, but can you talk a little bit more about what you see as the main problems, the main issues with how things are set up now here concerning independence in the two parties, and maybe even more importantly, why and how the Independent Center hopes to sort of to try to minimize some of these issues, these problems?
Yeah. So, the parties, and I think you've said this, the parties are actually very bipartisan. They have a lot of agreement on the fact that they shouldn't allow third-party candidates.
Yeah.
And that independent voters really don't deserve to be enfranchised. They don't get to cast their vote. And we think that that is unfair and unconstitutional. The right to vote is enshrined in the Constitution. And in some states, the parties have passed regulations for voting that make it virtually impossible for people to exercise this right that they have. And, the parties are private institutions. They're not part of the government. They are private institutions. So, we work with some other partners like Open Primaries that are much more informed and eloquent on this subject. But I just think it's really important for people to understand how much the parties have limited voters' participation in certain states. For example, by having closed primaries where you can't vote in the primary if you're not registered. as with one of the parties. Where open primaries does its work, they will tell you that they get tremendous legal challenges from the parties who want to prevent people from voting when they're not a party member. And it's really damaging to democracy, because what it does is it drives out people who are actually more nuanced in their views, who aren't deep partisans. And when we talk to when we talk to independents and ask them, what do you want to see from government? What are your primary concerns? What we see are people who want to see bipartisan governing. And that's not surprising, because, Washington, D.C. is really the only place I know of where you have two parties who have made it their objective to not reach across the aisle and not reach consensus by and large. Everywhere else in people's everyday lives, they find ways to work with people who disagree with them. You do it in your job, you do it in your community, and you do it in your family. And so it's just this very odd little corner of America where you have people who have gotten together and agreed that the worst possible thing they could do is talk to members of the other side. And I think it's just crazy. And I think it's why a lot of independents don't feel like they have a political home, because they look at this process of politics, especially in Washington, D.C., and say, this is absurd, it's inhumane, it's dehumanizing, and we don't want any part of this. So there's nowhere in politics for us, but we really deeply need them. And you asked so many questions. I'm sorry, I don't know if I covered all of them. That's an important one.
Yeah,
Send me that.
I so feel this, because I used to be a Republican, and then I ended up, now I'm kind of center left. And I was thinking about this recently, and I realized that I don't actually feel I'm a Democrat. I'm a guy who votes almost exclusively for Democrats, because they're, to me, less bad than the Republicans. And I sense that there are a lot of independents or a lot of centrists who are in the same sort of boat. It's not even that we want another political party per se, but we want our party to be better, to be more responsive to us, which, and is that your sense of, because you've thought a lot and talked to a lot of independents, is my experience kind of common, or maybe a little bit different, or what?
No, absolutely. In fact, so many people reach out to us and say something very similar to what you just said, which is, I feel like I have to vote for the lesser of two evils, and I don't like it. I want something different. We look at this as introducing competition to the political environment, and competition in markets gives consumers more choices, and it makes them better off, because competition drives prices down for the goods you want to purchase. Competition is what makes companies create a product offering that is more closely matched to what you want. And so where we have this artificial lack of competition in politics, it makes consumers and voters worse off. And, I think it's very comfortable for the two parties to sort of, it's like they've reached this equilibrium where they're going to talk to their voters who support them no matter what, and just avoid reaching the rest of the voters. And I think that this has been really damaging. I think it's been one of the key drivers of polarization, because it helps them to make this winner takes all kind of framing, where it's like, well, you have to vote for us. Look at how awful the other side is, and you're saying, hey, I think that there's a lot of space between you guys, between the two positions you're offering. And there's better policy there. There's better candidates there. And I think so many people feel that exact same way. They are exactly what you said. A person who happens to vote Republican sometimes, or who happens to vote Democrat sometimes, or does some of both, but they're not Democrat. They're not Republican. And so actually what we're doing at the Independent Center is, when people ask me what we're trying to do, I say, we're not a think tank. We're trying to create a movement, because what we need is people with an identity as being nonpartisans, being independents, because, identity really supports behavior. And I think it's hard to get yourself excited to go to the polls if your identity is like, well, I'm neither of these guys.
You know, it occurred to me when you were talking about that how deeply weird in some sense political marketing is. It's like you don't see Chevy putting out a bunch of ads saying Ford trucks are so awful. You're probably going to die if you're in a Ford truck. So, you know, you should buy a Chevy. I mean, there's literally no other place I can think of, at least off the top of my head, that does that kind of just like, well, we're not as bad as they are. It's kind of weird, isn't it, from a marketing background?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, what political marketing does wouldn't work for a moment in an open marketplace. And it's really incredible. And, you know, one of the most surprising things to me observing Donald Trump's effect on the Republican Party is that he's had a tremendously negative effect on the Democratic Party as well, because he's allowed them or encouraged them to step away from their own messaging about what they contribute and what they offer to voters. And instead, their messaging is now how awful Donald Trump is and the Republican Party is. And I think voters noticed that in the last election, and they said, like, well, what are you even offering us? So that part has been, and maybe it's not surprising to political scientists, but it has been surprising to me to notice, just like he's harmed the quality of the Democratic Party by being, by just kind of taking all the air out of the room.
And I know you believe, the Independent Center believes, that independent voters can be a pretty powerful force if they organize. But when I was thinking about that, I thought, well, what does it mean to organize? Well, generally speaking, I feel like you need something to organize around, some common values or goals or something. And the one I think of is, well, we're people who don't like either of the two major parties. I'm thinking that's probably not enough. And so I imagine you believe that there are certain values, certain preferences that these independents, or many of them, share. And I'm curious as to what you believe those things are.
Yeah. So, it's interesting because people, especially people like you who are like deeply versed in political theory and, how political trends have shaped the country over time. You guys have this question for me, which is a really interesting question. And I would say a couple things. So the first is, like, I don't think anybody is coming to the Independent Center and saying, will you please define the philosophical limits of this movement and tell us what you should be or what we should be, right? So, like, I wouldn't put us into that position because nobody's asking for it. And I think it's not our place. What we do is conduct research on independents so we can understand what their values and needs are and help them understand how policies connect to those values and needs. So we're really serving an educational role, right? Where we're saying, well, if immigration modernization is important to you, here's how this issue sort of works and what some good proposals are and what some proposals are that might not work as well. So in terms of, like, whether there's a kind of like policy platform or litmus test, I don't think that there is. And the other thing I would say is, if you want to have a really robust movement, it needs to be a coalition of people who have some agreement, but not perfect agreement. And I think one of the big weaknesses of both parties right now is that in terms of values, they've become what I call like monocultures, right? Like, there's one view and that's the only view, right? Like, what Donald Trump says is Republican policy those are the policy values. Nobody else's input is welcome. And Democrats are kind of in the same boat where, they're not trying to understand and land on the views of the bulk of Democrats. They're kind of being pulled leftward by the loudest voices in the party. And so, to me, what we need is a group of Americans who want politics to be consultative, consensus building, bipartisan, but not necessarily have 100% ideological lockstep. One of the things that I think I hear from independent voters a lot is that they believe that individuals should be treated with dignity and should get to make decisions about their own lives. And what seems to rankle them coming from both sides is hearing about, how awful they are, right? Because they disagree with the party line. And they just want to be given the respect to have their own values without being run out of the party. And as part of this monoculture, I think that both parties have just really gotten rigid around ideology. Like there's only one way to be a Republican. There's only one way to be a Democrat. So we're saying, like, you know what? If you have questions, you're welcome to be one of us. If you would like to see politics be something different, you are welcome here. We also have questions, and we think that elected officials should have to answer those questions.
I think there are some folks who would, at this point, say, well, wait a second. There's an assumption that both Mike and Laura are maybe making here, and that's that partisan politics is really this bad thing. And I'm thinking of a counter argument. Some people might say, well, if we go back to what you could call the golden age of bipartisanship, that kind of period, like FDR to the Gingrich in the early 90s, when you look back at that period where the parties worked together, it was in large part because the Democrats ran Congress for almost all of that time in a way that we don't see at all. And Republicans were just such a small minority, they kind of had to go along to get anything. And so I think a lot of Republicans would say, well, thank God for Newt Gingrich, and thank God that congressional Republicans are actually relevant like they really weren't in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s for the most part. And so partisanship actually is a positive, as a sign of strength. It's a sign that there's real political competition as opposed to just one party dominance. I was curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I'm not a political scientist, and I should make that clear. And I'm not saying that partisanship is always completely negative. However, I think that what we see now is parties who have also managed to arrange the features of democratic engagement in a way that doesn't promote bipartisan governing. It doesn't require bipartisan governing. The incentive to be bipartisan just isn't there. And so, I'm not saying that, we should get rid of parties. I think parties work perfectly well for some people, and they are entitled to engage civically through a party if that fits with their values and needs. I think the problem that we're talking about here is that there's not a way for independents to engage civically. And we need to enfranchise them because our government functions better and the whole country functions better when the most people participate in democracy. And when we make it hard or impossible for independents to participate, or just for for candidates who are not partisans to participate, I think we are making democracy less effective than it could be. And, the electoral process and the civic process, these are ways of getting feedback from individuals into the government. And where those roots of feedback get cut off, I think it makes society very unstable. And we need to appreciate the fact that, large groups of Americans have said that they're dissatisfied with the government and they feel unheard. Depending on whose polling you look at, it's 72%, it's 80% of Americans who would say, I don't feel that my interests are represented in Congress or in Washington, D.C. And that, I think that is a feature of just extremely polarized political life, right? The fact that people do not feel heard or represented. And that should be concerning to everybody.
This episode is brought to you by GMC. GMC certified service technicians are factory trained to fit your vehicle with the tires specifically developed for it. And with our tire price match guarantee, you get the best fit for the best deal. Let us do the work. Available on select eligible tire brands and participating dealers only. Offer ends 12/31/2025. Terms apply. See dealer for complete details. Visit gmc.com/service to learn more.
My favorite thing about Shipt since I signed up for Target Circle 360? No price markups when I order same-day delivery from tons of local stores. Only a handful of alcohol retailers and items don't count. I won't lie, I've had too much fun being like, markups on groceries? Not in my fridge. Markups on pet food? Not for my DOG. Markups on tools, electronics, home goods, meds? Not in my house. Anyway, it's awesome. Order now at shipt.com/360. Terms apply.
It's certainly concerning to me. But when I think about how we've gotten to this point, I think of some pretty hairy, difficult structural things. Like we've got single member districts, first past the post, winner take all, essentially. We don't have ranked choice voting hardly anywhere in federal elections, a few exceptions. And then we have social media, which creates these partisan filter bubbles and just the massive resource advantages that the two major parties have. And so it seems to me that if we're really serious about giving voice to this great mass of dissatisfied independent voters, that's where we need to start. And I'm wondering what you think about the structural barriers to this sort of thing.
Yeah, that's such a great point because, they're incredibly smart and incredibly well-resourced groups working on a lot of the barriers that you just mentioned. And it is incredibly difficult. How do you get media to change the incentives around how they make money and how they operate? I don't know. I can't imagine, right? How do you get Congress to regulate itself in a way that is better for voters instead of better for individuals? I couldn't begin to tell you. And I think the best tool available to us right now is these independent voters. Because interestingly, if you think about what it would mean to have to reach independent voters in order to win, it would actually bring both parties closer together, closer to the center on more of their policies, because the independents are there in the center, right? And so if you make it so that I said that wrong. If you exclude independents from voting, then all you have to do is keep your base happy, which is incredibly easy to do. But in the last 3 elections, independents are the ones who have delivered the presidential vote, right? They swung for Trump this time. They went to Biden the time before that, and they went to Trump in the election before that. So this is a really powerful force for accountability because independents are the path to which you win the presidency. And I'm not saying that means that we need an independent or third party presidential candidate. I think what we've seen in recent years is we're just not ready for that. However, electing members to the U.S. House of Representatives who are independent is a much more feasible path to getting independent representation. And that actually would force Congress to be a lot more bipartisan because they wouldn't be able to get anything done without appealing to these independent representatives. So the way we look at it is, it's hard to address these structural changes. They are massive. They're difficult to shape. And the players who hold the reins aren't interested in reform. But this type of competition that independents offer is something that's available to us right now. And so even if they're voting for a party member, right? That's what we want them to do is, if you're somebody who doesn't like either party, the best thing you can do right now is go vote for the lesser of the two evils. And if you're in a district where an independent is running and they align with your values, then absolutely vote for them. But exercise your vote, and we're going to sort of force either the parties or an independent organization to give us the candidates that are what voters want to see.
because you can't expect to change the system if the people in charge of changing the system have no interest. And so you need new people in there to kind of make that happen. As you point out, that Congress is a lot easier to lift. And that gets me into, I guess, what I understand to be, or what I think I understand to be, the sort of strategy, at least initially, for the Independence Center. There was an interesting, really good piece in the Washington Post on the group. And it seemed for me, what I gleaned from that is the plan is to try to recruit independent-minded candidates, particularly in swing districts. You set up a super PAC to help fund their campaigns. And then the idea is to get enough of them into office to affect the balance of power. And so all of a sudden, they become the decision makers on these many close votes. Is that kind of right? Or kind of help me out with this?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Independence Center is C3, which means we only have an educational mission. We work with some people who are going to create, or who have created, a C4 and a PAC, but those have to be managed entirely separately from our C3 for legal reasons. So we want to be really clear that there is a wall between those organizations. But the Independent PAC is just one of a number of organizations that are working to fundraise in order to provide financial support to independent candidates and independent-minded candidates and provide expertise. So we're one of a number of groups, or, the Independence PAC is one of a number of groups that are working to try to support these candidates for exactly the reason you said, which is it would change the balance of power in Congress. So instead of being winner take all, nobody has the majority, and you have to come to the middle and agree on policy issues if you want to pass anything.
What do you, with which voters, I guess, do you think you will have likely the greatest impact? The swing district thing makes perfect sense to me. That's where you're going to get the quickest returns. But what voters are you focusing on, or is it just kind of a broad-based thing?
So, excuse me. It's interesting, the thinking here, because I think traditionally people have looked at these purple states and swing states where power goes from one party to the other and across different elections and said, well, I bet an independent could succeed here. But what some other groups and strategists have pointed out is that there's probably a really good opportunity in states that are, deep red or deep blue, because in those places, a member of the opposite party can't win, but there's probably a strong likelihood that a more centrist candidate, for example, an independent candidate, could be successful there because they're not, fully on the opposite side. They hold some of the characteristics that would appeal to this broad swath of voters in the middle who aren't far right or far left supporters of the Democratic or Republican Party. And I think there's a really big opportunity there that hasn't been explored. And, the people who are saying, well, this will never work, are the members of the parties, right? It's like in a red state, it's Democrats who have looked at it and said, well, there's nothing that can be done here. And it's true from a Democratic lens, there's nothing that can be done in a red district, but that doesn't mean that an independent wouldn't be successful there if they're just it's a little bit closer match to the voters' preferences.
That's an interesting way of looking at it. So I've spent a lot of time on the Independence Center's website, and when I read the value statement that you have up there, to me, I got a really strong libertarian kind of feel from it. I mean, the first paragraph, you talk about individual freedom, personal choice, economic growth, fiscal responsibility, social tolerance. I mean, it's like the libertarian greatest hits sort of thing. And so I'm wondering if it would be fair to accurate to characterize the Independence Center as sort of libertarian in orientation. And if I'm wrong about this, what do you see as sort of separating the Independence Center's values from the values that I kind of associate with a typical libertarian?
Yeah. So I think the values that we have on our website are, you see them in libertarian spaces, you see them in classical liberal spaces, but I actually think they're just kind of fundamentally American values. Americans believe that they should get to make choices about their own lives. But in so much of our policy, we've set it up so that people don't have choices. You have very few choices around, say, health insurance or your retirement savings and Social Security, right? Like these are all areas where we've taken choices away from people. But in the research that the Independence Center has done through both polling and also some AI-driven insight work that we've done, what's really remarkable is that those are the values of independent voters. So this is not us putting our lens on it. This is what these voters are saying is important to them. And I think I would say it kind of rhymes with some classical liberal principles, but it's also different in certain ways. I think that the Libertarian Party in the United States has not made great inroads with voters because something that they are offering is off. And I'm not familiar enough with their platform to be able to speak to that. But I do think that Americans are sort of at their heart people who believe that individuals and communities are incredibly powerful forces for making great things and for creating human flourishing. And so we want policies that make it possible for people to make choices for themselves. And also, I think something that's, we haven't touched on this so far, but something that's really interesting is that it's younger voters who are really driving this wave of being independent. 52% of Gen Z and 52% of millennials self-identify as independent. And I think that, what I take from that is that these younger voters are very different than how kind of political strategists are thinking of them. And they want to make choices for themselves. But what's really interesting about them is that they really deeply respect the right of other people to live their lives the way they want to. And it's this amazing thing. There are a bunch of groups working on pluralism right now and kind of promoting pluralism in the United States. And I think what's so cool about these younger voters is that they are the poster children of pluralism. They want to live their lives the way that's important to them. And when their neighbor's doing something vastly different, they kind of go, hey, that's great for you. And I think that's what is fundamentally American and what we need to make sure is represented in the voting process.
I think there are some people who would say, well, we really do need some sort of a third party. We need people to abandon the parties. There's old bumper stickers say, don't vote, it only encourages them, right? And the idea being that, right, but you need to do something to let them know this will not stand, and we're just not going to continue with the lesser of two evils sort of voting. And that's how you voice your opinion. When you're voiceless, you just kind of pull out of the thing. But then there are other folks who say, well, no, we don't want that. We actually want people to get more involved in their parties. If you're dissatisfied with your party, the answer isn't walking away and becoming independent. The answer is sort of like what Republicans have done in the post-Trump era is a lot of MAGA Republicans got really involved in their local parties, wanting to make sure that elections were, in their view, fair and safe and all that sort of thing. And that's the way to have an impact. And so I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And some people that I really deeply respect have said exactly that thing to me. The quote is something like, well, if somebody was breaking into your house, you wouldn't just leave and say, okay, all yours now, right? You would protect it. And that's what they're doing is they're kind of doubling down on engaging with the party and trying to shift the forces. I think that if that's what they believe is the best path, I'm very heartened to see them do that. From my vantage point, it looks like it's extremely hard if you are, say, a more traditional Republican who's not happy with the MAGA forces, it's very hard for you to turn the tide that is the MAGA phenomenon. And the same thing from the Democratic point of view. I think there are a lot of people who are calling for the Democratic Party to come back closer to the center and step away from some of the more hard left voices. But it's like trying to steer a battleship, right? Like it's just incredibly difficult. So, I'm also not saying we should have 1 million parties. And I'm not saying independents are going to be like a permanent third party in the United States. To me, this is something that is going to shape and shift over time. But the underlying principle is that we can't, it's not constitutional, it's not moral to exclude these people from participation. And it's not even good for the country, right? Like we need more people participating in political life, not fewer. That's how we get to a government that actually works. So I would say that the polarization we're looking at right now is directly a result of this sort of really negative equilibrium point that the two parties have gotten us to. And that how you make them sort of readjust where the equilibrium has landed is through political competition.
And so when you think about this process, because it's a lot of times people would say, well, what we need a dynamic independent running for president and kind of be a top down sort of thing. And that hasn't been anywhere close to successful. I mean, Ross Perot made kind of a dent back in the 90s, but before that, you have to go way back. It's clearly not going to work. And so it seems to me that what you're talking about is a strategy that requires a fair amount of patience, perhaps. And so I was curious, I'm sure you've thought about, well, what does success mean? And what's your roadmap, if you will? And so could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So for us, success is growing the largest audience of political independence that we can to create a movement and an identity. So right now, I think we have about 250,000 or so people on our newsletter list. So that's about 250,000 people who have reached out to us and said, hey, I'm in, I want something different. And our goal is to help them connect with each other, help them connect with information they need to engage politically in order to exercise their constitutional rights. And so you're right. It's a very much bottom up type of approach rather than top down. And I think the problem with top down, as you've seen from like the Forward Party and No Labels, is it's kind of a moonshot. It requires this one very charismatic leader to appeal to enough people to be able to win the highest office in the land. And that is incredibly challenging, right? Like, that's the definition of a moonshot, because it kind of assumes that you can understand the preference of all these voters and provide them this one person that will appeal to them. And I just think it's a long shot, right? Like the parties have had a lot of time and experience selecting presidential candidates, and that matters. So this is, in terms of how long it would take, my suspicion is that people have been wanting this and waiting for this for so long. The number of people who reached out after that Washington Post article has just been extraordinary. We got a ton of signups to our newsletter. We have people emailing us and saying, hey, I want to run for office. Can you help me figure out who could support me or where I can get resources? We have people reaching out and saying, hey, I'm an attorney and I can help because I am an expert in electoral law. That kind of thing makes me think that there's a huge appetite for this that's just been suppressed. So I suspect it's actually not going to be as challenging or as much of a long-term play as the parties have kind of claimed it is, right? Because if you think about like who the voices are telling us that independents can't win and that, their data suggests there's no independence, a lot of them are Republicans and Democrats. So I think that it's not as far away as it looks. I also think this is where marketing as a field says something kind of interesting. So as a marketer, what people sometimes would think about is, you're trying to create behavior in consumers with investments in marketing, right? Like you're doing an ad strategy. You are having a celebrity endorser, right? Like you're spending money in order to get consumers to go to the store and buy your product. And the less appealing it is to buy that product or to create that behavior, the more it costs, right? So I kind of look at it as political marketing spends tons of money pumping out these negative messages, right? Like just deeply partisan, look how awful the other side is. And they have to do that in order to get people to vote. But if we're offering something more appealing, I think it will actually cost a lot less money to motivate that voting behavior.
Yeah, it often occurred to me in my wild fever dreams of running for office that I quickly push aside. But I often think, wouldn't it be cool to run a completely positive campaign? I don't even know if it's possible, but to market myself or whatever, more as you'd market, I don't know, like a Hyundai or something like that, right? But we don't see that at all. And so I'm really curious to know if that sort of thing would work. And it occurs to me as well in terms of strategy that one possible way to do that would be to try to demonstrate to people, really focusing resources on a couple of races that you think are really winnable. Because if people don't think something is possible, the only way to convince them that it is possible and get them on board oftentimes is to say, well, see, look at this. We did it here. We did it there. And so we can do it with you too. And we don't yet have that we did it here, so we did it there. So you got you maybe Bernie's an independent, but not really, in that sense. And so what do you think about that strategy of either kind of really focusing in to give people a sort of a proof of concept, or are you thinking about going broader? Or can you give me a sense of that?
Yeah, so I think you're right that electing more independent candidates would absolutely be a proof of concept and let people know, like, hey, there's a there. And so I think that will be a tremendous, I think that's what's going to get the ball rolling like really rapidly is once you see a few more independents in office. There are a handful, as you noted. And increasingly, there are people running for office as independents. We see independents running for governor in some states. And so I think that's what's going to create in people's imaginations, like, oh, yeah, you know what? I could participate in politics as a nonpartisan and say, as a lot of independents do, there are things that I like about both parties, or there are things I dislike about both parties. So I think that's a big part of what we need to accomplish is just sort of creating a mental model for what it means to be a political independent. And I also think there's this huge false consensus effect, right? Where when you look at electoral maps and you see all of these red states, right? Or you see a bunch of blue districts and you go, okay, well, I know what they think. These are all people who want to see abortion bans, or these are all people who are, in favor of free college tuition, right? Like you think that you know what they believe, but it turns out that there's an incredible amount of variance in the views of both Democrats and Republicans. And I have some research that points to this. It's called Beyond Polarization. It's a study that I did with a colleague of mine, Aaron Norman, prior to joining the Independence Center. And what that shows is that you need to know a lot more about people's actual beliefs than just their political party in order to be able to predict how they would vote. Because there's just so much variation within the party on all kinds of policy issues. And that matters because it means that the way that we've defined people's political views based on just knowing Republican or Democrat is really inaccurate. And so, if you're looking at the country and saying like, nope, there's nobody here like me, everybody else is team red or team blue, I'm out here by myself in the middle, it's very hard to want to go out and vote. And yeah, it doesn't seem like it's likely that politics is going to offer you candidates or policies that are aligned with your values. So what we're trying to do is kind of break down that false consensus and say, look, there's more people like you, like we're all here. And I think that's going to be heartening for voters, but I also think it's going to bring out candidates who are closer to these voters' preferences and maybe make the two parties offer candidates who are closer to these voters' preferences.
Let's talk a little bit about timeline. Now, your super PAC, the Independent PAC, just started in 2024. And I got to say, when I saw that, it's like, wow, I can't believe no one thought of the name Independent PAC before, but it wasn't taken.
Right.
So go figure. But so you're starting from, obviously from nothing, where everyone starts from. So do you think you're going to be able to get up and running in time for the midterms, or what do you think about in terms of rollout and where you hope to start having a real impact?
So I can't speak for the C4, for the PAC,
right.
And I don't have insight into the operations. I know that they would like to have enough funding to run a handful of candidates in the 26 election. And I'm hopeful that they'll have the funding that would support that, because I think that's really what our audience wants to see is like, hey, help me find people that I could vote for, that I could be excited by, that I could support with contributions. They want to know where these independents are. And so we're like out there looking for people to be able to point to and say, hey, if you are a political independent, this is somebody that you might want to know more about.
When I pull back and think about this in broader terms, well, by nature, I'm an optimist. When it comes to politics, I feel like I've become more and more of a pessimist, pushing through my normal optimism. But it seems to me like this is an effort I'm obviously a fan of, or else I wouldn't have been talking to you. But I feel like partisan warfare is likely to get a lot worse before, or really even if it gets better. And so when you look at this landscape, obviously you are not just wallowing in despair, or you wouldn't be doing the work that you're doing. So when you look around, what are the things you see maybe that give you at least some reason to feel optimistic that independents can possibly break through?
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing that's given me the most optimism since the Washington Post article published, but even a little bit before that, is that people reach out to me constantly through LinkedIn, through our website, and they say, this is me, you're describing me. And they say, I love this, how can I help? And so I've never had a job before where people reached out and asked me if they could help me do my job. Yeah. And that makes me think that there's some real appetite for this. And so, yes, I feel like it's difficult work, but it's very possible. And I realize like a lot of people are very disheartened by the political news they're reading today. And I think those of us who work at the Independent Center are some of the most optimistic people that you'll meet, because we feel like, no, there's a path here. There's actually some real change that's happening in a lot of different areas, right? It's beyond just people saying, hey, I'm excited about this, I want to help. You know, you see candidates who are saying, actually, I'm going to run for mayor as an independent. I'm going to run for governor. So I think that's really encouraging as well. And then just the broader sort of framing of independent politics that we're looking at, right? Where we're saying, hey, swing voting counts, split ticket voting counts, because what it is fundamentally nonpartisan or less partisan. That makes me feel really encouraged. You know, we see states like North Carolina where they will swing for Republican president at the top of the ticket, but then elect a Democratic governor, right? Or have go back and forth on senators. And so I think there's more of that than people recognize. And people have kind of looked at that type of split ticket voting and said like, well, I don't even know what that means. And the Independent Center is here now and going, oh, we know what that means. That means people who see that there can be a match between what they want to see in elected office that isn't just described by the letter after your name. And that's actually self-governance. That's actually democracy. And we just want to encourage more of that.
Well, I certainly think it's a good thing. And I'd say for listeners who are interested in helping Lura do her job, we will make sure we have a link to the Independent Center in the show notes. And again, I wish you all the luck in the world. Lura Forcum, it's been a pleasure talking with you today.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you want to get in touch with us for any reason, you can do that in a bunch of ways. There's email, mail@politicsguys.com, as well as Facebook or X. Links for those are in the show notes. There's also our Discord discussion forums for supporters, which I am on all the time, probably too much. No. But anyway, if you're not already a supporter, I hope you'll consider becoming one. When you become a supporter, you not only help us continue the work that we're doing, but you get ad-free versions of everything we release, as well as the full-length midweek episode, as opposed to just that 15 or so minute preview. And if you'd like to get that full-length midweek episode, but you're not in a position to financially support us right now, not a problem. Send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, it really does help us out if you subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And finally, a very special thanks to our executive producers, Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, and Brian Matza.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,